Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I'm Lara Friedman. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Today is November 21st, 2022, and it is my pleasure to have with me world-famous documentary filmmaker, Julia Bacha. Julia is a Peabody and Guggenheim award-winning filmmaker. I've never had an award-winning filmmaker on here before. That's very exciting. She is a media strategist, and she is the creative director at Just Vision, an organization that fills a gap on Israel-Palestine through independent storytelling, strategic audience engagement, and they are, by the way, a grantee of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. We're very proud to support their work. Julia, most people may be familiar with her through her films. She started her career in Cairo, where she wrote and directed the 2004 film Control Room, which became one of the highest grossing political documentaries of all time and introduced the world to the inner workings of the Al Jazeera satellite channel. She subsequently moved to Jerusalem, where in, let's see, is that right? No, I've got these out of order. 2006, she co-directed and wrote in Counterpoint, which followed Palestinians and Israelis who risked their lives and public standing to promote an end to occupation and the conflict. In 2009, she directed and produced the critically acclaimed Budrus, which chronicled the story of a Palestinian community organizer who united Palestinian factions and Israelis to save his village from destruction by Israel's separation barrier. In 2012, she directed and produced the award-winning documentary My Neighborhood, which follows a Palestinian teenager struggling to reclaim his home in East Jerusalem from Israeli settlers. We're almost done here. In 2017, she directed Nayla and the Uprising, which chronicles the journey of Nayla Ayesh, whose story weaves through the most vibrant nonviolent mobilization in Palestinian history, the First Intifada. And finally, in 2021, Julia directed the documentary Boycott, which is about lawsuits brought by 3 American citizens against state laws targeting boycotts of Israel and settlements. You can follow Julia on Twitter, assuming Twitter still exists when you're watching this podcast. It's at Julia Bacha, Juliabacha. So Julia, with all that, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Lara, for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I wanted to have you on the Occupied Thoughts podcast today in the context of an issue that is just beginning, I think, to break into mainstream consciousness, which is the growing campaign against quote unquote woke capitalism, and specifically the attacks on what's known as ESG. And ESG, which most people probably don't know, is shorthand for environmental, social, and governance as factors to be taken into account in investing as part of what's called socially responsible investing. So most people, both in the general public and even in the ESG focused community, are probably thinking to themselves as they hear this podcast, why is an organization called the Foundation for Middle East Peace, which focuses on Palestine and Israel, why is it even interested in this? And what does any of that have to do with acclaimed documentary filmmaker Julia Bacha? So answering that question is in effect the purpose of this podcast. So just to lead off, I want you to talk a little bit about the movie Boycott, because that relates directly to the conversation today. So talk to us about this movie, the focus of it, and how it came about.
Boycott came about as the result of our team at Just Vision witnessing the spread of anti-boycott laws across the United States with very little public scrutiny or debate. These laws started to percolate in 2015. They accelerated in 2016 and 2017, up to the point where we are today, where there is more than 34 states that have one version or another of this bill that conditions public employment and public investments on companies, or in some cases individuals in certain states, if they are involved in a boycott of Israel, or if they simply refuse to sign a pledge stating that they will not boycott Israel. So this is a law that has been challenged now in several states by Americans from different political backgrounds who, for different reasons, decided to take their states to courts, saying these bills are unconstitutional and violate their First Amendments. We have been following these lawsuits for about 4 years now. And it is the personal story of 3 of these Americans that form the backbone of the film Boycott. At the same time, the film also does an investigation to understand how these bills have come to pass and who were the lobby groups behind making this very effective campaign, succeed in passing a bill that violated a pretty fundamental right that Americans hold very dearly, the right to free speech, the right to boycott, which has been at the core of the most important social justice movements in American history. And with very few people even asking questions of their legislators of why they're passing this bill and what is the motivation behind it, and are they concerned about the constitutionality of these bills. So those are the questions that the film Boycott seeks to ask.
So I want to highly recommend that people watch the film. What Julia and her team have produced is, as a historical document, is quite extraordinary in terms of documenting who is behind these bills and how they're getting passed. I'm not going to ask her to cover every bit of that right now. What I just putting a pin in the question of who's behind them. So I want you to talk a little bit about sort of what came after this movie. I think it was starting a little bit when the movie came out, which is something that you and I've talked about in the past, which is this idea that these laws were always ripe to be repurposed to go after other areas besides, quashing free speech on Israel. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So for us at Just Vision, we were concerned about what these bills meant for the ability of Americans and civil society generally to advocate for Palestinian human rights, because these bills are, one manifestation of a broader effort to squash dissent and prevent civil society from expressing solidarity with the Palestinian people. And there are many other tools that are used by the Israel lobby in the US and in Europe primarily for this effort, but also in conversations with you, Lara, and with someone like Alan Leverett, who was a plaintiff in our film. He's one of the plaintiffs whose story we profile. And Alan was motivated to sue the state of Arkansas, not because he's boycotting Israel, because he's not. He in fact didn't even know that such a movement to boycott Israel existed until it showed up in his contract. And the reason why he decided to sue is because the moment he read that clause, he knew that that was a Pandora's box, and that if he signed that as a journalist, he would be opening the way for the government to try to be able to tell anyone, any company, what is the political positions they need to take in exchange for taxpayer funds. And that is a fundamental violation of the Constitution. And Alan was not willing to accept that, and decided that it was critical for journalists to stand up to that. And we wanted to, sound the alarm bell of the possibility that this bill would be used as a template to attack our ability to advocate on other issue areas. When we were making the film and we interviewed you, Lara, and I think one of the most clear, critical arguments in the film is made through our interview with you about that danger. It was still theoretical when we were doing the interview with you. And by the time we were locking picture, we were in the editing room finishing the film, the bills have started passing. And now it's been about a year since the film was launched. And we have seen now, I think these bills have been introduced, the new versions of the anti-boycott bills targeting your ability to boycott the fossil fuels industry, to boycott the firearms industry, have already been introduced in 19 states. It has been passed in, I think, 5. And it's very likely that come spring 2023, we are going to see an avalanche of these bills in the state legislatures coming into being, particularly because ALEC, which I'm sure is an organization we'll be talking more about today, the American Legislative Exchange Council, has already made it clear that they want to broaden the anti-boycott bills to basically try to make it impossible for any political motivated boycotts to be acceptable if you are also seeking to do business with the state.
So let's dig into that a little bit more, because there's a few pieces here. One is maybe just take a moment and explain the logic here, the legal logic, because in effect, what legislators are arguing is we're not in any way quashing your free speech, your right to protest. We're just saying if you want taxpayer funding, you've got to do X, Y, Z, because we are responsible to the will of taxpayers. They elected us. This is the will of taxpayers. So can you talk about that a little bit? And can you also talk about ALEC as a, and maybe other actors, but particularly ALEC, and the new draft legislation that's now been published on their website for December 2022 consideration?
Yeah. So in terms of the legal argument here, right, it's that I think what they're trying to say is that there is a limit to your First Amendment when you seek a public contract. And that has been very clearly established by the Supreme Court that that's not the case. By becoming a public employee or seeking public contracts, you do not give up your First Amendment at the door. The First Amendment is protected. And there's a very narrow scope in which governments can control speech if it is directly related to the person's job, right? So in some degree, if your speech is directly related to something of the work you do in a particular office, then the government can maybe tell you that, under certain circumstances you cannot speak. But in circumstances like this, which you're talking about, a politically motivated boycott, whether it be of a corporation or of an entire industry or of a foreign country, the idea that the government can condition public employment or public contracts on particular political viewpoints has already been established legally that it's not allowed. And that is, if you think about it, that's for good reason, right? I mean, we all are taxpayers. We all give public funds to the government. And so therefore, we should all be equally allowed to have access to these public funds. And the government shouldn't be able to tell us that, if I'm an environmentalist, I cannot have a public job or a public contract anymore. Or if I want to stand for Palestinian human rights, sorry, those public funds are not available for you anymore, right? That would put us in a very slippery slope of an authoritarian regime. And you see that in authoritarian governments historically and today, where yes, you have to have, there's very clear political speech that is determined by the government. And that is a dangerous place for us to be, because if it is, the current legal challenges, they are specifically about contracts, but really they are about the constitutionality and protection of boycotts. And if boycotts are not considered to be protected speech, then the government can go beyond the idea of not even giving you a public contract. They can criminalize boycotts if there's no protection for it, right? So it's a really dangerous argument that I think the sort of legislators and lobbyists who are arguing for that, the consequences of that are pretty severe of what they're trying to argue here. And what we see, though, is that it's very understandable how they ended up here because of who's behind it, right? And so that takes us to ALEC. So ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council. And generally, the people who know ALEC, by and large, associated with sort of a pro-corporate lobbying outfit focused at the state level. And the basic idea, as we've seen it, operate, has been, how do we make it easy for businesses to work across the country and across state lines without having at each point of the way to deal with different environmental protections and protection of the labor force. And so you have to modify everything state by state. How do we make it really easy for corporations to work across states without having to deal with unions, without having to deal with environmental protections? And so they push these bills. They are cookie cutter bills. You just need to put the name of your state in it. They are generally agreed upon in these annual and biannual meetings that are closed doors, where corporate leaders come together with state legislators. The vast majority of the ones who come, the elected officials, are Republicans, and they vote on these bills. And the corporate leaders have the same, the vote of a corporate leader is valued the same as a legislator. So they vote. If the bill passes, then it becomes a model bill, and the legislators are encouraged to take them back home and pass them. What people generally don't know is that ALEC actually started as an evangelical organization. So ALEC was founded in the early 1970s. One of the co-founders was Paul Weyrich, who was a conservative evangelical leader who founded many conservative organizations in the 70s as part of the movement at the time to sort of counter the progressive change that was beginning to happen in the second half of the 20th century. And there was obviously, women's movement was beginning to take place. There was desegregation, Brown versus Board of Education in 1953. Then in 1971, the attempt that the conservatives had done to just establish Christian schools was now in grave threat because the Supreme Court said, no, you cannot be tax exempt. You cannot be a tax exempt Christian organization unless you have an anti-discrimination policy. And because that was their attempt to sort of run away from the segregated public schools, was to establish the segregated Christian schools. And that moment was really a turning point. And ALEC very much comes at that moment where the evangelical movement wants to push against this progressive social change. They find quickly, I think within like 2 decades, that they can't financially be sustainable with only the conservative evangelical philosophy. And so they align themselves with corporate interests, which make the whole operation financially viable. But this evangelical conservative strain is very much part of the foundation. And still we see that today. And the anti-boycott bill vis-a-vis Israel, the one basically trying to protect Israel from Americans advocating for Palestinian human rights, comes through that origin story of ALEC.
So that's really helpful. I'm going to put in the notes that go with this podcast a link to the new ALEC bill, which was published, I think, in the past couple of weeks. So what you've basically sketched out, or we've discussed here, is the anti-boycott bills, which target boycotts of Israel. And by the way, they also target boycotts of settlements, the occupied territories. They treat those as one and the same, pretty much all of this legislation. And the evolution and the repurposing of those bills to go after, so far, as you said, the guns and ammunition industry and fossil fuel industry. I would add that we've also seen 2 bills introducing, it's Minnesota and Idaho, that take that same template and add in a whole long list of other industries. And that's basically the new model, the model ALEC bill, which was just released. And to be very clear, the new model ALEC bill is explicitly framed as an anti-ESG bill. So you can see that arc. So the first part of answering the question, why are we talking about anti-ESG legislation when we're people who focus on the Middle East, is because there's a direct line, this arc between the anti-boycott bills trying to protect Israel and the anti-ESG bills. So that's one line. The second part that I want to talk about is, or the second piece of this, again, for answering the question, why are we talking about this? I want to ask you to talk a little bit or respond to what happened with the Morningstar case. And just as background for people who are listening who aren't deeply familiar with this, Morningstar is in some ways, I think you'd call it like the beacon of the ESG organizations. It is seen as the courageous organization, the leader, it really is kind of the role model in the sector. And Morningstar in the past year and a half or so has become the target of intense attacks led by Jewish American organizations and pro-Israel organizations who effectively have argued that Morningstar and an organization that does ESG analysis that it acquired called Sustainalytics are anti-Israel and anti-Semitic and engaging in BDS because Israeli companies were being caught up in the S screen, that's social, which is a human rights screen. And they said, if you're basically calling out Israel for human rights abuses in the occupied territories, that's BDS. And it was a massive campaign. In the initial phases, Morningstar, in its attempt to defend itself, brought in a major law firm, which did a review and basically found that they were doing nothing wrong, but suggested some ways to maybe be better. And Morningstar effectively at that point dumped their major human rights report for, I guess, fear of having Israel show up on it. But their actions there to try to even be accountable and extra accountable were seen as admission of guilt in the sector. And all of the forces that were attacking them and adding to this the more broad anti-ESG forces that are not Israel focused necessarily double down. And then a couple of weeks ago, they announced their new policy, which is quite breathtaking. So the major ESG organization in the sector basically announced a policy vis-a-vis Israel, where it is dumping international law. It is rejecting anything that touches anything from any UN agency or organization. And it's rejecting research and data from the organization on the ground, the Palestinian organization in Israel, that is the only organization on the ground that actually documents and researches the intersection between investments, business, and violations of Palestinian rights, which really, basically, they've carved out an explicit ESG exception for Israel itself, and they have given a template for politicizing ESG on any issue and demeaning the or challenging the entire sector. So this is, again, talking about why we're talking about ESG here. This is the case study. So can you talk about, from your perspective, having studied the evolution of anti-BDS laws, the implications of this case? You know, what can people learn from it, and also, to the extent that you can draw some conclusions on what maybe people in the ESG sector are doing wrong, what they're not understanding about how you defend what you're doing with these kinds of attacks.
I think it's really terrifying to see what just happened, and the idea that, you know, you can hear people already thinking, and, you know, similar to how I think, you know, Lara, I believe you faced similar things at the time when you were trying to sound the alarm bell, that you were alarmists, right? Like that this is that the anti-boycott bills at the time were going to be used to attack this whole other slew of but what, there's no evidence of this, why it's going to happen. And then, of course, you know, the first bill that passes, which is the one, you know, preventing you from being able to boycott the fossil fuels industry, the, you know, lobbyist who pushed it very explicitly said that he was inspired to do that because of the anti-BDS bill. And there is no question that all of the different industries are looking at what's happening with Morningstar and seeing a perfect path to protect their own interests. Because the reality of all of these things legally is that either something is legal or something is not legal, right? So either there isn't this idea that, oh, the human rights of Palestinians are not are to be put here separately, and then everything else is okay to come in. That doesn't exist, right? This isn't a legal framework that is something that is going to, you know, unlikely to pass legal muster unless something, you know, very profoundly intense happens in the entire American legal system, which, who knows, could happen. But I think there is the forces will be there very quickly to look at Morningstar as a great model to follow, to basically prevent all of the progress that has been made in decades now, where environmental activists have been advocating for companies to start putting screens. You know, that has been so much the model that has been pretty successful in companies. Even BlackRock, you know, have sort of started looking at these things, and we're gonna see the possibility that all of this is gonna, you know, whatever 2 decades of work will go down pretty quickly in the next year. And there is, I think, a somewhat of a reluctance sometimes in, you know, in activist circles, environmental circles, or, you know, people fighting for gun safety, or, you know, whatever other issue area that that people care about, that they are concerned that if they start talking about what happened to the anti-BDS bill or what happened now to Morningstar, that's a toxic conversation and that's going to hurt them. And that is, I think, you know, a somewhat understandable initial reaction based on, yes, how much of a cost it's often incurred to stand up for Palestinian human rights in America. But I think it is, I think it's not understanding the scope of the effort here that is being done by groups like ALEC and other corporate interests to understand how this opening now will be abused pretty severely. And if there isn't an incorporation of this idea that every human right, needs to be respected, that if we're going to stand up for human rights, we have to stand up for human rights equally. I don't know that there is a way of protecting anybody's rights if you're not willing to have that universal approach.
Yeah, no, I think that's beautifully said. I was on a panel recently on a related topic, and one of the other speakers said something, very demeaning about people like me, because we're warning about slippery slopes and arguing that was sort of, it was lazy, intellectually lazy. We should be strong enough. And I'm like, it was just surreal, because literally what he was calling, like, you say slippery slopes, like, we're already there. This isn't, just if we'd had this conversation 5 years ago, you could have said, well, it's a warning, it'll never happen. I can say, I'm pretty sure it will. We're already there. So the sort of, dismissing the idea that this will have broader implications it's afactual and very worrying. I want to ask you a little bit about, there's so many directions I want to go, and I don't want to keep you too long. We try to keep these podcasts a little bit shorter so people can just process a lot of information. Going back to Boycott, the movie, for a minute. So one of the cases, and you mentioned Alan Leverett. So one of the cases, Alan's case, actually now has been appealed to the Supreme Court. Can you offer your thoughts? And I know that you and I talked about this previously, because I tend to be very, someone's called me like gloomy. I don't think I'm pessimistic. I think I'm a realist, but I think as a realist, I tend to, not necessarily, see the positive outcomes as probable. I want you to talk about this case that's going to the Supreme Court and what lessons can be learned, both positive and negative, from the efforts to use courts to challenge this anti-free speech trend, and maybe extrapolate from that a little bit what needs to be done for people who are just coming to as an anti-ESG issue, who basically say, listen, I don't give a crap about Israel-Palestine, and I'm really unhappy that you're telling me I need to give a crap about Israel-Palestine, which, to be clear, that is the point, because I've always said, you may not care about Israel-Palestine, but it cares about you and it's coming for your rights. So maybe help extrapolate from the experience of people fighting the anti-BDS laws. What are the better ways, or what is available now before it's too late to mobilize and engage on the anti-ESG side of things?
The first thing to say is that the Supreme Court decision on Alan Leverett's case, if the Supreme Court decides to take it up, right? So in terms of where we are right now is the ACLU about a month ago petitioned the Supreme Court to hear Alan Leverett's case, and specifically they would like the Supreme Court to overturn the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals decision that ruled that the Arkansas anti-boycott law is constitutional.
And just to interrupt, to be clear, for people listening, the case that's going to be, if they decide to take it to the Supreme Court, isn't merely deciding whether Alan Leverett, as a person in Arkansas, has a right to boycott as a matter of free speech. They're basically being asked to decide, in general, whether the act of engaging in an economic boycott is free speech, right? So this is, again, when I say that, Israel-Palestine cares about you and is coming for your rights. The decisions that are being made in courts vis-a-vis these laws have implications for all boycotts, not just for Israel-Palestine related boycotts. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and I think what you're saying is that it's the reflection of a reality that Israel-Palestine is theoretically a foreign policy issue, but in the U.S. it's a domestic issue and has always been, and it's going to continue to be. Now this is not only a national issue; it's at the state level, right? Like when you look at how these bills are being passed, because it's harder to pass these bills at the federal level because there's more attention being paid. So strategically, the lobby went for the state legislatures. And what I think one of the things that was really striking to follow is, obviously this is a case that has made its way through the courts in the post-Trump era, which was a time when Trump actually stacked the courts around the country at all levels, the district level, the circuit court level, the Supreme Court level, with extremely conservative judges. And we saw that play out, right? Like a court like the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is already traditionally a more conservative court, has now as one of its judges, Judge Cobes, who actually came straight from being an advisor to a federal senator who actually was a co-sponsor of the federal anti-boycott bill. And so he legally was already involved in this bill, and then is being asked now to decide if it's constitutional or not. He refuses to actually withdraw himself, and becomes the writer of the decision that basically is a very stark sort of overturning, they can't overturn, but challenge to the NAACP versus Claiborne Supreme Court decision from 1985 that said very clearly that, based on the history of the civil rights movement in America, one of the cases there ended up in the Supreme Court, and they said boycotts are protected. And now this is under threat, right? So a civil rights era ruling is now being put, is being threatened by the effort of the Israel lobby to protect itself from accountability. And this is going to have tremendous consequences for everybody else. And so how does this now affect other issue areas? If the right to boycott is not constitutionally protected, then efforts by other social movements in the future could be not only penalized, but could be criminalized. And so you really lose, the form of civic engagement that was actually at the core of how the United States started its revolution against England, right? Which is the boycott of tea. So it really goes really deep, the sort of implications of this. And so I hope that people will very much pay attention to this moment. If the Supreme Court takes it up, I think it's critical for all social justice movements to be, to really mobilize around it, because the consequences would be tremendous.
Yeah, and I'll just add, going back to why we're talking about this today, one of the things that was interesting watching the movement, and you cover this actually in the movie quite well, the passage of these anti-BDS laws in states, is they were framed as the pro-Israel bills, and progressive Democrats, this was not partisan. There's a lot of, I think, efforts, or maybe it's an assumption that this stuff is partisan. And the anti-boycott bills were not partisan. They were bipartisan. They had strong support from legacy Jewish American organizations that are proudly nonpartisan or bipartisan, and they got bipartisan support from legislatures, including by legislators who maybe had never read them and were in any way cognizant of the implications, or maybe just decided, like I've heard from people in Washington, I don't care, I'm going to vote for it anyway, this is the thing for Israel. And it's sort of a sense of, if we have to curb boycotts in general to save Israel from boycotts, I'm okay with that. And I think that's really an important piece to understand as we think about what's happening with anti-ESG legislation. Because again, I think there is an instinct to say, oh, this is ALEC, it's partisan, it's gonna, there'll be partisan pushback, and that probably is true in some cases. But at the same time, as soon as you inject Israel into it, it stops being partisan. And we've seen this in New York already. As soon as you make this about, Morningstar and having ESG screens that might capture a couple of Israel companies, suddenly it becomes something where, oh, no, we can all be against ESG because ESG is just cover for anti-Israel, pro-BDS stuff. So that's where it leaves it. I will add to the notes from this webinar a few things if people want to look for them. I will say, so Just Vision has a fabulous, very beautifully designed interactive database of legislation. I have a far less beautiful table of legislation, which also includes, I have a separate table just looking at the metastasizing legislation, where it's not looking just at the BDS bills, but specifically with ESG. And I've got a database of articles which go back as far as 2016. And I think it's worth noting that there's a report from an Israeli organization called Rayut, I believe, from 2016, which literally and explicitly makes the case that socially responsible investing is a threat to Israel and has to be somehow that challenge has to be met. So as far back as 2016, they were watching this. Julia, do you have any last thoughts you want to give for people who are coming to this issue and trying to figure out what it means to defend the things they care about most while not desperately hoping it's not going to get hijacked by Palestine-Israel issues?
I think, I don't know how that answers your specific question, but one thing that I came across recently that I didn't know about was how much ALEC was part of the effort to stop the international movement to end apartheid in South Africa as well. And so I think that was just a moment of like, okay, they have been at it for a long time, right? These interests are very connected. And I think the idea that, there are so many, well-intentioned, organizations and organizers who want to protect their niche against getting into the messiness of this conversation. But the messiness of this conversation is after all your good intentions. And so I think we're gonna have to be courageous in this moment if we are to preserve our ability, to fight for the things we care about. And I think in that process, we are hopefully likely to actually build movement towards social justice that is actually more principled, and that does actually include, that is more inclusive, that does recognize that our futures are interconnected and that we can't be siloing specific groups or specific issue areas because they are inconvenient.
Thanks. And that actually reminds me of one last non-optimistic point that I did want to add, which is for folks who haven't been paying attention, the Anti-Defamation League, like the week before last, announced that they have acquired the organization, which in theory is the organization that engages and supports ESG from the Jewish organizational perspective, called JLens. And the Anti-Defamation League statements around that acquisition make clear that fighting the targeting of Israel as part of ESG is a priority. It's seen as the new priority area for fighting quote unquote anti-Semitism. I put it in quotes because I don't think that's actual anti-Semitism, but defending Israel and fighting quote unquote anti-Semitism by what is one of the most powerful and largest, I think it frames itself as social justice organizations from the Jewish communal world in the country. So that is certainly going to add to the challenge going forward. We're going to have more conversations about this, Julia. We're going to end here. I'm going to ask you, I'm going to warn you now that I'm going to ask you to come back probably for maybe a webinar to have a broader discussion on this, but I'm so grateful for your time today. Thank you. For our audience, sorry, go ahead.
Just said thank you for having me.
Yeah. Be careful, because when I ask you back 10 more times, you're going to be like, no, too much work. I've got real things to do. For our audience, thank you for listening and for watching. And reminder, assuming Twitter still exists in the future, you can follow Julia there at Julia Bacha. That's at JuliaBacha. Check this podcast online on our website for the notes, which will include a whole wealth of resources on this topic. And finally, I want to remind people, subscribe to the Occupied Thoughts podcast. You can do so on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. That way you won't miss any of the great content we produce almost every week. And you can also find this podcast and the video of it at our website, www.fmep.org. And with that, we're going to end it here. I'm Lara Friedman, president of the Foundation for Peace, for Middle East Peace. Thank you, Julia Bacha of Just Vision, and signing off now until the next episode of Occupied Thoughts.